My name is Dr. Redgina Hill. I am the Vice President for Inclusion Equity, and I want to welcome you all to our conversation with myself and Dr. Daniel Horan. He's new to campus, but I'm so excited to have him on campus and really looking forward to this conversation. But before we jump in, I want to read our land acknowledgement and then read Dr. Daniel's bio. We wish to acknowledge and honor the Native people in their traditional homelands on which we stand. We particularly recognize the Pokaka Band of Potawatomi and the Miami, who have been utilizing this land and its resources for many years and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we acknowledge the Native people and their culture within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. Dr. Daniel Horan is the director of the Center for Spirituality and professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology at St. Mary's College. He previously held the Duns Scottish Chair of Spirituality at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. A columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, he is the author of 13 books, including Catholicity and Emerging Personhood, a Contemporary Theological Anthropology, which received the 2020 First Place Award for Theology book from the Association of Catholic Publishers. And his latest is titled A White Catholic's Guide to Racism and Privilege, which is why we're here today. But his next book, which is due out this fall, is The Way of the Franciscans, a prayer journal through Lent. Dr. Daniel regularly lectures around the United States and abroad, serves on a number of university, academic, and publication editorial boards. He is also the co-host of the Francis Effect podcast. Please welcome Dr. Daniel Horan. So I had the opportunity to sit in on Dr. Dan's interview. How long ago was that? Maybe about 2 months ago?
Well, in pandemic times, it was about 14 years
ago. About 14 years ago. And I remember sitting in the interview just so impressed with his resume, with his scholarship, how he had conviction about the answers to the questions, in particular that I was asking about inclusion and equity. And I just remember at the end of the interview telling him, you better do whatever you gotta do to get this job because we need you here. And there's so much work that we can do together. And our first meeting, which was not too long ago since he started, we scheduled an hour meeting, but our time together was 2.5 hours. And we talked and we planned events. This is the first of many events that we have brewing. But we just really want to make a difference on this campus, and I'm so excited that he is here. And we are becoming fast friends, and that's what I'm so grateful that God connected us through our work together. But you've recently written a book that is listed here, A White Catholic's Guide to Racism and Privilege. And for those of you in the room that are wondering, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to ask this first question for you. I know the answer. I know the importance, but we'll address the elephant in the room. Why is a white, cisgender, Roman Catholic, ordained priest writing about racism and privilege?
That is the elephant in the room. And so I'm not kind of copping out of answering this, but as a preface, let me just say that it goes both ways. I am so excited to be here. I think this is my first sort of formal public event here, and I'm so thankful to Dr. Hill for all the work she's doing and in her division and her team, for the team in the mission division and everybody else. So yeah, it's just been absolutely wonderful. That 2.5 hour meeting could have gone on for another 5 hours.
Yes.
And so it's very exciting. You know, you asked exactly the key question. And it was a question that I asked myself when my publisher from Ave Maria Press, my editor of the publisher, approached me about the possibility of working on this book. For the last 7 or 8 years, I'd spent a fair amount of my time as a columnist, as a professor, as a researcher, talking about, thinking about, writing about the realities of systemic racism, the plague of white supremacy in the U.S. context, as well as its implications for believers, particularly for Roman Catholics. As a Franciscan friar and a Catholic priest, this is something that's been on my mind a lot. And like a lot of folks, last year, just the public response, the awareness in the wake of a series of horrendous murders at the hand of police, especially that of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the Black Lives Matter movement that had spurred renewed attention. This is not a new thing, but for white folks in particular, for many of them, it was new to them to be aware of the persistence of racial injustice, harm, the inequalities that exist in our society. And so I was approached with an invitation to think about writing a book that would address this topic. My question that I asked myself was very similar to this one. What does a cisgender, white male, Roman Catholic priest who happens to also be an academic, and at the intersection, I'll just be straightforward about this, of about almost every kind of privilege you can think of. I'm able-bodied, I'm neurotypical, I could go on and on and on. But the truth is, racism in our society and our context affects everybody, and it affects everybody differently. And this is something I didn't write this book because I'm the expert in this area. By this area I mean anti-racist activism or DEI advocacy. You are the expert in that. But when I prayed about this and reflected on this and consulted a number of friends of mine, colleagues and trusted friends about whether this was something to pursue, the thing that kept coming up was the conversations that take place around race in our society tend to be spurred on by tragedies or occasions that are under great duress and stress. Furthermore, they often happen as a result of tragedies like the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others that rise up for some reason or another to a national level of attention. What doesn't often happen is a conversation among people who look like me, talking to one another about the realities of systemic racism, about the persistence of white supremacy in our history and in our society and in our church, and what race means for people who are identified or identify as white like myself. The kind of analog I think of is, something that's so inspiring and so important about the legacy of St. Mary's College by way of analogy, which is gender, right? If we talk about feminist reflection, part of what's necessary is for men to recognize that misogyny, sexism, patriarchy, it has a role for us too. Like we're playing a role in this, and the role of privilege, and we'll talk about that I'm sure some more, covers over the place of men in a patriarchal society. Likewise, white folks, by virtue of white supremacy, systemic racism, the privileges that are accrued to people who are identified as white, blind us, and when I say us, I mean people who look like me, from recognizing the complex realities that we're a part of and contribute to. So that's really the motivation. Why me is because I'm part of this system, I'm part of this world, I am on the benefiting side of the coin by no deliberate choice of my own, but in a society where there is persistent injustice, I felt like I have to say something about this, and I wasn't in a position, nor am I ever in a position, to tell my sisters and brothers of color anything about the experience of what it means to be Black, or Indigenous, or Latinx, or of Asian descent in the context of the United States. But it is incumbent on me, as I think it is on all of us, to continue these conversations, especially among people who are white, about these realities and the responsibilities that arise, that should be taken up, I should say.
I have so many questions. And like I told you earlier, I don't know if we'll get to them all, but you just sparked several more questions for me. But for the people in the audience that hear you say racism and systemic racism, in your book you define racism in two different ways: common sense racism and systemic racism. What's the difference?
Yeah, it's really important, and to give credit absolutely where credit's due, I use those two terms from Father Brian Massengale, who is a Catholic priest and moral theologian at Fordham University. he, in his book, The Catholic Church and Racial Justice, makes that distinction. Common sense racism is what I think most folks, especially white folks, think of when they hear the word racism. You might think of white hooded, white supremacists, KKK folks, or you might think of the use of a derogatory racial slur, or overt policies or actions that harm individuals or communities of color, perpetrated by not always, but almost always white people. And that is a form of racism. That is absolutely racism. But as Father Massengale says, that's common sense racism and doesn't include the bigger picture. When we talk about systemic racism or a culture of racism, we're talking about the things that don't seem apparent right away, especially if you are on the benefiting side of that unjust dynamic. And so what does that mean? It means that the term itself, systemic, that it's deeply embedded within our system, that there are institutions, that there are structures, that there are laws, that there is a culture that is itself racist. And when I say racist, I mean a system that arbitrarily assigns value to the appearance of one group of people and disadvantages or subjugates another group of people based on their appearance, and in this case we're talking especially about the color of one's skin. And so in the US context, there's no part of our history that isn't touched by this reality. And that's what we mean by systemic racism. And we can talk about lots of examples of this. There are historical ones that I think come to mind for many people, whether it's the wealth gap, whether it's the way I mentioned earlier, part of the impetus for writing this book was the increasing awareness of the way that people of color are being treated by authorities, particularly those in police agencies in different parts of the country. And that's one great example, is I, as a white man driving down the road, if I get on 90 and I'm driving, I get pulled over. I don't often think, I never think about the fact that I could be shot just for being myself, right? That my life isn't, that my life is in danger. My biggest concern is, am I going to get a ticket and get in trouble? Mm-hmm. And the fact that other people are constantly, because of the color of their skin, because of the system that predicates certain judgments, preconceptions, assumptions onto folks, that imbalance exists. That's what we mean by the system. That's just one example. There are lots more we can get into.
What do you say to people who hear you give these definitions and say, well, what about reverse racism?
I say there's no such thing. Reverse racism does not exist because racism is about power, and it's about who has power and who doesn't, and how it's used. We often talk in circles, learned circles like a college such as St. Mary's, we talk about the social construction of race. Mm-hmm. It's analogous to conversations about how we understand gender in other terms. Race in this case is almost meaningless, except that value is placed on the appearance of a group of people, and disparity exists between the way those groups of people are treated. In the US context, there might be racialized prejudice. There might be people of color who dislike white people, or dislike another ethnic or racial group. However, the power to do something about that, to structurally harm an entire group of people, not just individuals, or not just to harbor individual resentment or prejudice, is not equal. And so to say reverse racism is to say that the structure, if flipped, would work exactly the same way. And our history, our laws, our society, our faith communities do not reflect that. So we need to get away from that. This is not to say that there isn't such a thing as individual racialized prejudice. People can harbor prejudices, hatred, frustrations, whatever, against any individual or group of people they so choose or are reared to believe. That's different from, again, the systemic racism we're talking about, that this is deeply intertwined into our history. And part of what I hope to accomplish in this book and in conversations like this is to help folks like myself, including myself as a constant reminder, to realize that this imbalance, this injustice exists even when people who aren't directly harmed by it, such as myself, we are harmed by it, white folk, but not directly in the same way. That we need to be reminded of that.
In response to the first question, you talked a little bit about having this responsibility to talk to other white individuals about racial injustices. And I know there's conversations and a lot of conversation in 2020 about not putting the onus on people of color to teach white folks about the injustices that we have been experiencing for centuries in this country. Tell me a little bit about this responsibility. Why do you think it's important for white people or white Catholics to take responsibility for racism and privilege?
Well, a part of it is, well-meaning white people, especially, for instance, as you mentioned, over the past year, who, let's say, become either briefly or in a more sustained way aware of these realities that we're talking about, the reality of systemic racism, the reality of white supremacy as a cultural presence in our society. There is, I think, a genuine desire for people to want to do something, to learn something, to change. We saw that, I think, with the protests last summer, especially with the desire for resources. But oftentimes what happens is well-meaning white folk, well-meaning, emphasis on the well-meaning, not malicious, end up kind of outsourcing the responsibility onto people of color to come in and tell them what they should already know, the basics, let's say, to do their fundamental homework. Simple things like what we're talking about this afternoon, like what do we mean by racism? What do we mean about the social construction of race? What do we mean about kind of statistical and clear evidentiary material that shows these disparities? The reason why that's really problematic, not all the time, but oftentimes, is because well-meaning white folks invite people of color in and then are not prepared to hear the truth that they have to say. So that's part of the problem. Another part of the problem is, and this is disturbing to me, but it's also a fact, which is that statistics reveal that white folks are more inclined to listen to other white folks talk about some of these racial truths, the realities of our injustice and of our history, than they are listening to persons of color. And so what does that mean? That means that there's a responsibility among white women and men to have these conversations with one another. You bring up the faith component too, as a Catholic priest, as a religious, as an academic, I have certain platforms, and I think that it's our responsibility, when I say our in this case, I mean white folks like myself, to initiate these conversations, as difficult as they can be, as uncomfortable as they usually are, and they should be uncomfortable. So if some of you or all of you are uncomfortable this afternoon, you're doing it right. So congratulations.
I feel the thickness in the room.
Yeah. And that's okay. I mean, I think it's worth saying that too. It's okay. Mm-hmm. This is uncomfortable. It's discomforting. We don't solve everything by reading a book or writing a book or talking about it or having one conversation. But I think one of the things I experience as a white man in our society is that when white people get together, let's say in our family contexts, maybe in our classrooms, in our departments, in our dorms, we're not talking about this. Part of it is out of fear, an assumption of, well, what is the other person going to say? Or what if I get something wrong? That's oftentimes what motivates white silence and in mixed conversations of people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. But it's also true among just white homogenous conversations. This doesn't happen. So my hope is that conversations like this, books like this, are an invitation for us, a modeling for us to keep doing this and to have these conversations.
So you touched on one of the benefits of whiteness, in that not having these conversations about racism and privilege. And in the book, you talk a lot about your whiteness, and you linked it to the term coined by Cheryl Harris, whiteness is property. What is whiteness, and how does it translate into property?
Oh, wow. All right, so we're ready for another 2.5 hour conversation. So, yeah, Cheryl Harris a legal theorist and professor, coined this term whiteness as property in the early 90s. And what she was really getting at, so I'm going to kind of reverse answer your awesome question there, is that it's more than a descriptor. It's more than a term we use to describe phenotype or the way one appears, the color of their skin. It's a term that Cheryl Harris used to describe everything that comes with being labeled or categorized as white. So if we think about systemic racism and a culture of white supremacy, there is this categorizing of peoples. To this question of what is whiteness, well, it's varied. It's changed. You need to give me a year. If whiteness is the question, what is whiteness in 1820, I would not have been considered white because both sides of my family are of Irish descent. And similarly, later in the 19th century, those of Italian descent and Eastern Europeans and those of Eastern European Jews in particular, various people who are now kind of identified as white were not necessarily considered white. Whiteness is fluid, as is other racial categories. It goes back to when we're talking about race as a social construct. It depends on the time, it depends on what parameters are being used, it depends on so much. But what Cheryl Harris was getting at is that whoever is admitted into this category we call white at a given point in history, there are actual tangible benefits that come with that. In some sense, this is what we mean by terms like white privilege. White supremacy is a descriptor that also refers to this, which is to say that to be white means everything that is of your experience, typically, culturally, ethnically, racially, is normative. Another thing that comes with that is, as you just mentioned there, Dr. Hill, that white people don't have to think about these disparities or injustices. Another thing, the way that it really hit home for me as I was reflecting on Professor Harris's really insightful and now classic characterization is one of my hobbies. So I'm a runner. It's one of my favorite things to do. I get to travel a lot because of the work that I've done and the ministry I've done over the years. And I write in the book about how the murder of Ahmaud Arbery was really striking to me, not just because of its viciousness, but because the question I asked myself is, what's the difference between him and me? What's the difference between Arbery and Horan? I've run in rural places in the Deep South. Not unlike, he wasn't even in the Deep South. He was in a kind of an ex-urban neighborhood in Georgia. But I've run in different countries and places where I am the numerical minority. I talk about how I've even gone running. I lived for a summer in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and so I'm much taller than most of the folks who are native to Bolivia, and they're not used to seeing bright white Irish Dan Horan running, at 12,000 feet above sea level. And I never felt, I might have felt uncomfortable, I might have felt unsure about where I am, but I never felt like how I appeared, the color of my skin, was a liability, or that excluded me from a right to be in a certain place. And that's one of the things that distinguishes Arbery's experience from my own, is that even in his own home neighborhood, in his own hometown, where he was going to do something that I took for granted every day, he didn't have what Harris would call that property. He didn't have that benefit. I think sometimes in conversations with other white folks, we talk about white privilege and people will say, well, I'm struggling to get by, I come from a working class or a historically impoverished family or community, where's my privilege? And this, I think, is case in point in what Harris gets at when talking about whiteness as property that's not about things that you can, it's not about your bank account necessarily. I think, for instance, of Dr. Skip Gates at Harvard University, or I think of Senator Cory Booker, or I think of President Barack Obama, or I think of so many other folks who are very accomplished, very wealthy, have a lot of status, celebrity fame, assurance, and yet can tell and have told their stories of being racially profiled, of being pulled over for driving while black, for this, that, and the other. And one of the things that I think of as a white person that I want white people to think about as well, when we talk about whether in the language of whiteness as property or white privilege, is what are the things that you are protected from, that you never have to deal with, that you never have to think about. That I could go for a run to the same neighborhood as Ahmed Aubrey and not once have to think about my life being on the line. There are other forms of privilege that exist that way too, and I recognize that as a man, there's gendered privilege. I wrote a piece about my experience as a runner shortly after the death of Mr. Arbery, and a number of cisgendered women said to me, well, what about the fact that it's dangerous and scary for women to go running? I totally agree. But the difference is when you start looking at all the ways in which society treats one's racial identification versus gender, there's still obviously sexism, patriarchy, misogyny that exists, but there's something that's unique to white supremacy and systemic racism. And I think that's what Professor Harris gets at when she talks about whiteness as property.
Yeah, I love her article in the Harvard Review. If you get a chance, if you're a nerd like me, to read it. But I was struck by her story where she talks about her grandmother being able to pass as a white woman and making the decision to cross over the tracks to get employment as a white woman, but then crossing over at night to live her life as a black woman. But one thing that Professor Harris pointed out in the article that really struck me was she said that her grandmother was complicit in her own oppression. And I thought, wow, the decision that she made for economic resources for her family, she was complicit in her own oppression. It's a really good article. Shameless plug, we're having an event in the spring about critical race theory, 7-week series, touching on each tenet, and whiteness as property is one of those, and so we'll dive into that a little bit deeper. Another question for you. When you think about what is happening now in our country, where there is an attack on things such as critical race theory, the 1619 Project, some of these other truths that are out there, they're not coming out, they've been out there, especially within my community. We hear these stories, these are stories that are told down from generation to generation. And I often use this African proverb, until the story of the hunt is told by the lion, the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And so I try to live my life in such a way that I tell the story of the lion. And in this instance now, it seems like the story of the lion is being under attack. Why is it so hard for people to accept these truths about systemic racism that has occurred in this country?
I love that proverb, by the way. It's really apropos. I think, well, there have been a couple different ways I think scholars and activists have sought to describe why this dynamic plays out. At the heart of it, sometimes folks have referred to it as like white fragility or white rage. Both of these, I think, are very useful terms. I talk about them a bit in the book as well as points of resistance to accepting the truth of our history and of our reality. At the core of it is fear. Fear of a lot of different things. I think fear that the lies we tell ourselves and that our communities advocate are untrue will implicate me in something. So there's fear of being blamed. I think this is another reason why conversations around, racial justice don't happen oftentimes, certainly among, majority white communities, is because there's this fear that somehow I'm going to be blamed for this. I think there's fear around the exposing myths like that of meritocracy. And you hear this exact kind of language by pundits and politicians and ordinary folks alike, where it's like, you mean to tell me I didn't earn what I had? That this is white privilege? It's because I'm white I've been given these things? To which I want to say, in part, yeah. But, as somebody who benefits from that, I have to acknowledge that. It may not be somebody on the street, that I'm aware of, there's no office where people are literally handing out money because I'm white, but in effect, historically, that's true. It accrues over time. it seems to me that it's just fear of complicity. It's fear of facing reality. And this is what's really hard. It's scary. I'll be honest with you. This is a scary conversation. I mean, all of you guys are all so scared that you couldn't even sit in the first 8 rows. It's scary. And I think I don't have a really good answer other than the fear, I think, underlies a lot of that. You know, I've talked, I don't know that actually in our conversations in recent weeks that you and I have specifically talked about this, but I've talked to other friends and colleagues of mine who are, you know, chief diversity officers or people who work in the area of anti-racism, who are women and men of color, and they often make it clear they're sick and tired of being the ones who have to bring the topic up because it is exhausting, it is demoralizing, and it's scary. A friend of mine who's a white theologian in Chicago, who'd spent a lot of time growing up in the South, he's from Georgia originally, you know, he talks about, you know, I'm going to mess up how he phrases it, it's so much better, but I think about it often where he talks about the risk that women and men and children of color take to speak these truths that those in power don't want to hear is so grand, so large compared to the discomfort that those who benefit from this unjust system have to feel to talk about these things. And so I'll be the first to admit that I'm scared to talk about this at times. But I also think there's a humility that's involved in that, a vulnerability that we have to risk. And I say we, especially, I mean white folks like myself. And to say, I don't know all the answers. You know, I don't. But I don't know, fear is, I think, why people don't want to hear this.
One of the things that I appreciated about reading this book is your willingness to be vulnerable, to admit that you didn't always get it right when in those instances when you had opportunities to speak up against racial injustice. So there may be others in the room that experience that same fear that you just spoke of. What advice would you give to them who are afraid to speak up, who are afraid of rocking the boat, but know that they want to do something? What advice would you give?
Okay, so this is advice to myself because I don't do this very well, and I risk some vulnerability in this book and tell some stories of my own experience because I know I'm not speaking from a position of having all the answers or getting it right. I think defensiveness is the biggest problem, the biggest hurdle to authentic conversation about race, especially for white people. I speak from my own experience. There have been times where very dear friends of mine, and I write in the book about a colleague and friend of mine who is Asian American, who in a conversation that we had with a group of other folks, we're just chatting, and I said something, the particularity of which is totally innocuous, it doesn't matter, but that he got offended, and I didn't understand why. You know, we have technical language like microaggressions and this sort of stuff. It wasn't intended, I wasn't being malicious, I wasn't trying to hurt anybody. And in that moment, I felt defensive. I could tell my friend stiffened up, he was uncomfortable. He made a kind of a quick remark, which I'm grateful that he did because it named that I had done something, though I didn't understand it. And my immediate gut reaction was to be like, what the hell, man? I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't intend to do anything wrong. I didn't kind of protest like that. That was my internal dialogue. You know, that was the inside voice where I felt self-righteous, where I'm like, he's just being overly sensitive, quote unquote. And in time, it didn't take that much time, but a little bit later I realized I didn't do anything wrong, and neither did he in what I said, right? There wasn't intention to harm, but what was wrong was my reaction to the situation. So the first advice I would give is, white people need to recognize, like I have to constantly remind myself, that there are things that because of the reality of white supremacy in our culture, the fact that my experience is presumed to be normative, all the more so as a white man in the United States. That I'm going to be shielded from the experiences of others and how other people are perceiving things I say, my presence in places, what I do, what others are saying and doing. And that invites me, the challenge for me is to listen and to see and to not give an account of myself that favors the lion. That says, I didn't mean any harm. It doesn't matter. The second thing I would say is, I think a lot of white silence arises from fear of saying the wrong thing. So this is like folks who want to have these conversations, whether in the classroom or in other contexts. And what if I use the wrong word? What if I say the wrong thing? Newsflash. It's gonna happen. You're gonna. There's no way around it. And you're going to upset people, and you're going to be embarrassed, and you're going to upset yourself. But it's about, and this is where I think the kind of religious element comes in. If you're a person of faith, if you're a Christian in particular, as I am, a Catholic, we're called to ongoing conversion and recognize we don't have it all at once. One step, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, this kind of thing. And so how one carries oneself in those kinds of conversations, what their disposition is, which I am the first to admit I'm not good at. I'm not a very patient person by disposition, including with myself. And so if I screw up, even sometimes I know what I should be doing, and for some reason I slip up or say something wrong, I'm inclined to beat myself up or to get defensive, to make excuses. And I think one of the best things to advise, and I say this to myself, is you have to let down your guard. You have to risk the vulnerability. You have to learn. You have to risk making the mistake. And if you do it in good faith, and when you are corrected and you're open to that, that's how real dialogue, that's how real change begins. Going back to that example of my colleague and friend, and that is just one of many embarrassing stories you can read about in this book, about my life and how I screwed up, is that if he didn't say something and I wasn't able to reflect on it and to engage with him after the fact about it and with others, then nothing's going to change. So, I don't know. It's scary. It risks vulnerability, but I think we have to do that.
Yeah, you talked about how this conversation is often uncomfortable, and I tell people all the time, I know it's uncomfortable, but if you push through it, I promise there's something beautiful on the other side. So don't stunt your growth in that moment of being uncomfortable, but push through it, and something beautiful, the awareness, the enlightenment is on the other side of that discomfort. In the book, you talk a lot about being raised in a Catholic household. Your education from kindergarten to graduate school has been in Catholic education. In your introduction, which I got stuck in the introduction, there were so many questions that just came out of this introduction. You said, "The church that I love and have dedicated my life to serving has nevertheless failed me and countless others at times when it comes to addressing racism." How has the church, how has it failed you, and what did the church teach you about racism?
The church is the people of God, first and foremost. I just want to clarify, I'm putting on my theologian hat for a moment. Like, when we talk about the church, what are we talking about? Because there'll be people, even some of you maybe, who are like, oh, here he goes. Father Dan Horan is going to say something mean about the bishops. And I might, stay with me. But they have a particular responsibility in the church, but we are the church. And so there is failure in the sense that we as a community of faith have not owned things that we need to own. We have not acknowledged histories that are dangerous memories that we would rather forget. And when I say we, I'm speaking particularly of white Catholics in my context, white religious leaders in particular. Though that's not always exclusively true as well. I mean, it's not my place to tell those stories, but when I say the church has failed me, I mean that it has participated and has been complicit as a community, as an institution, in the perpetuation of some of these lies about the way the world actually works. Part of that is by clear, overt complicit action. And we can talk about the ways in which certain dioceses in the United States and the Catholic Church promoted segregation within congregations, how certain Catholic religious leaders were members of the Ku Klux Klan and other hate groups and so forth. That continues to this day. We see it's transformed in terms of anonymous trolls on Twitter. If you don't believe that there are Catholics who are deeply in denial of the realities of the world, just look on Twitter. And then stop right away. Don't go deep in that rabbit hole. But I think more often than not, what I'm really getting at there is what we in the Catholic Christian community refer to as sins of omission. Right? There are sins of commission, things that we do, that we choose and act upon. If I see my brother Sean and he's angering me and I want to punch him in the face, that's a sin of commission. But if I see my brother Sean in trouble and I do nothing to help him, that's a sin of omission. It's what we in the church say is a failure, right? It's what I failed to do, not only what I've done, but what I failed to do. And in that regard, I feel like the church has failed me, has failed us, has failed our sisters and brothers of color, who are the church as well, in the failure to do certain things that need to be done. The church, the Catholic Church in particular, and its leadership has done a lot of good things, particularly at a global level, in terms of naming the reality of systemic racism, of racial injustice. I highlight a lot of ways in a chapter in this book about how the bishops, for instance, of South Africa, the bishops of the United Kingdom, the bishops of India have dealt with structural and systemic racism, the caste system in India, and so on, in ways that are light years beyond the U.S. context. But the U.S. bishops have, oftentimes reluctantly, have nevertheless spoken out about the sin and evil of racism in the U.S. context. However, here's my but. So those of you who are waiting for me to say something mean about the bishops, here we go. It's truth-telling time. They haven't done enough. They haven't done enough. And that's no more clear to me than in the 2018 document, the most recent document that the U.S. bishops have published on racism in the U.S. context. There's a scholar of anti-racism, he's a sociologist who wrote a book titled Racism Without Racists. It's kind of the flip side of systemic racism, like if it's a structural problem that nobody's to blame, And I thought about that a lot in reading the 2018 document, because there's a lot of easy truths that are told there, but we know that already. Racial injustice is bad, redlining is bad, healthcare inequality is bad, overt prejudice and discrimination is bad. It's okay, tell me something I don't know. What isn't named there, for instance, is why is our society, why are our faith communities, why is the world in which we live like it is? It's very one-sided. If we think of racism as a two-sided coin, those who are harmed and those who benefit, the lion, the beneficiaries of structural racism, systemic racism, were never named in that document. So that's another sin of omission, I would say. But now I'm going off too much. I'm getting on my soapbox. So, the 2018 document, I suppose, is better than nothing. But just to put it in historical context, again, my theologian hat goes on, it was almost 40 years between the documents that the U.S. bishops put out. Before 2018, the last one was 1979. And to give you a sense of the implicit racial bias that was in, again, well-meaning majority white bishops' conference, not listening to their sisters and brothers of color, not consulting experts and theologians and ethicists and sociologists and experts in DEI, but left to their own devices. The title of the document itself, the document's not bad actually, but the title says a lot. The title of the document is famously, Brothers and Sisters to Us. Let it sink in for a minute. Who is the us and who is the they? This is a document about the reality of racism. Clearly, the us is the dominant position, which means that whiteness is identified with Catholicism from the authors of that document, from the bishops of that time. Brothers and sisters, to us. The document in 2018 is titled Open Wide Your Hearts. And so that's okay, that's a bit better. The title is better. But it actually, in my estimation, and I go into greater detail in the book, and I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to, there are great steps back, in part because in our current age, with social media and with the politicization of so much, including something like racial justice, and even this past summer, as you mentioned earlier, what I would consider the absolutely absurd straw person of critical race theory that's being touted out by certain folks as to blame or as a problem or as some sort of agenda we're training kindergartners, to learn about graduate school legal theory. I'm like, if your kid is being taught critical race theory in your local Catholic school, good for you. What I mean by that is those kids have a reading ability far beyond any of St. Mary's College students because they're doing law studies already. That's an impressive school. I joke a little bit, but it's absurd, and I think there's that fear again. Why isn't there much talk about this? Why is there a reluctance to? I think the bishops, the majority of whom, disproportionately, overwhelming majority of whom are white, are afraid. They're by and large good men who want to do good work, and I believe we're called to ministry because they wanted to serve the people of God, but it's scary work.
Our time is winding up, and I've skipped some questions, and I had so many other questions that I tried to dwindle it down to 12, but we didn't get to them all. But this will be my last question, and then we'll open it up for the audience for just a few minutes for question. What are some actionable things individuals can do to promote and support racial justice?
Okay, so it varies. There are lots, and again, this is not at all exhaustive. I am not the end-all be-all expert on this. In fact, the person asking me the questions is more of an expert on this, and so I should be asking you. Maybe I will. I'll flip it in a moment. One thing I will say, though, is I think the reality of racial injustice in our society, in our churches, in our institutions, in our communities is so large that at times I think it's overwhelming and people shut down and they're like, well, what can I do individually? And I think it's analogous to climate change. When we think about the horrors of global climate change and how it's accelerating, it can seem like such a big thing. You're like, what can I do? You've already recycled, but that's not enough. Like what can one person do? A lot, actually. And so one of the things that I think is really helpful, and I'm going to give a shout out again to Father Massengale, he talked about teaching a course at Fordham once, and he was teaching this course about racial justice in the Catholic Church, and a young white woman, a student in this class, came to him. This was like midway through the semester, and I'm paraphrasing his story, where she came up and was very moved and very upset. She said, well, what can I do? I want to get involved. I want to be an agent of change, right? I'm seeing things I haven't seen before. What can I do? And Father Massengale said to her, you can go and talk about this with your family at Thanksgiving break. The way I thought about that too is you cannot let your fellow white family members, friends, dorm mates, classmates, colleagues get off the hook. Why does it have to be a person of color who calls out, as my friend did to me when I said something that I didn't realize would have upset him? That was a microaggression. I think those little things, those are a lot harder than signing up to do X, Y, or Z, or going, to this event or that event. As important and good as those are, that's one place to start. I think another thing is to look locally. Here in South Bend, there are lots of opportunities, lots of programs and opportunities through the Division of Equity and Inclusion. I think of the Office for the Common Good. I think of the Justice Studies program. I could go on and on. The wonderful center at IUSB that's led by Dr. Daryl Heller, the The Civil Rights Heritage Center is oftentimes doing programs and promoting advocacy, talking, most students here are not local residents, so you're not voting for people necessarily, but, speaking up when issues of law, issues of policy are on the table, being able to see with new eyes and putting that to action. At the national level, there are things one can do as well, and there are lots of things. I won't go through a list because that seems, also I'm mindful of the time, but I bring up that family thing because I think it starts truly local. It's not just about getting involved with the local Black Lives Matter chapter, which I highly encourage. I think that is something people should do. But it's also like, well, what are you doing in your circle of influence, with your family, with your friends, with your faith community? That's a lot harder. I'll tell you, it's a lot harder for me to talk to a family member than it is to sit in this auditorium. Even though my family members would probably sit closer than 8 rows back. I'm not going to let that go. I don't think we're that scary.
Thank you for sharing with us today. Thank you for writing this book. I think it is very important. If you don't have the book, you'll have an opportunity to purchase it afterwards. Shameless plug to the students, because I see you here. If you need extra credit, come see me afterwards. I have a form for you to fill out. But we have time for just one question. There's 2 microphones here, so whoever runs up first can get their question asked.
That's high stakes.
High stakes.
Maybe 2, can we do 2 questions?
Okay.
So that people don't feel like it all rests on their shoulders? Or comments?
Do I have to come to the microphone, or can you hear me?
I can.
It's being recorded, so we'll probably need to hear your voice.
It's hard to get out of these girls. Okay, so my question is about fear and shame. And because when you were talking about how fear drives it, is shame kind of a part of that? Or, could you just talk a little bit about that?
Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. We didn't use the S word, did we? We didn't talk about shame.
Or the other one.
Yeah, any S word. The thing I think of when I think of shame is a rocking chair. Shame can be something that's very debilitating, but it can also weirdly feel good to feel upset. And I think there is, going back to fear, in some of these conversations, I think there are a lot of white people who are afraid of feeling ashamed. But there also may be this desire sometimes to rest and wallow in the shame. That's not productive, nor is shaming others. There's a lot of talk, and I have many thoughts, and I'm of many minds about so-called cancel culture. Some things deserve to be quote-unquote canceled. I can't believe I'm even using that language right now. But basically what I think people oftentimes are referring to is not wanting to shame others, publicly shame people. When we're talking about the fear of having these kinds of conversations, shame should not be the end point. It should not be ever the goal, but it may arise. Sometimes I would call it maybe genuine or appropriate shame. Like, I felt ashamed that it didn't occur to me that what I said totally innocently in a conversation with my friend could be harmful. And I think I have a right to be ashamed about that, right? But if that's where I stayed, then that could, I wallowed in that, that doesn't lead anywhere, that doesn't go anywhere, it's not productive. It might fuel my own defensiveness. The goal should be acknowledging the reality and recognizing, because I don't know that we've talked that much about, it's probably, we had so many, so I wish we had 5 more hours, or at least 2.5 more hours or something. The goal should be, there should be also an understanding that this is not any individual person's fault. And I think that's where the fear of shame comes in. That all of this great harm is somehow my fault if I acknowledge the truth that we live in a racially unjust society. So I'm not being very eloquent in my response to you, but I think shame plays a big role. I think actually that is tied to the fear. I think it's important when we have these conversations, thinking back to the story of the student going back on Thanksgiving, or us in our own circles of influence, it should never be to shame the other person. But it should be to invite one another into some hard truths and realities. I can't help but think about it from a religious perspective to a faith perspective. There's a gospel in the lectionary cycle with a lot of the mainline churches and with the Catholic Church from a couple weeks back. It's one of my favorite gospel passages of all time, Mark chapter 8. Now you can see I'm a nerd, right? Where Jesus famously asked, who do people say that I am? And then he says, but who do you say that I am? And at first, Peter, kind of representing all the followers of Jesus, says, you're the Christ. And Jesus is like, yes, you get it. You got it, man. You're right. And of course, I love imagining Peter being like so proud of himself. Like, yeah, look at me. I know what I'm talking about. But then Jesus starts saying, well, let me tell you what that means. The Christ is going to be betrayed. He's going to be, executed. He's going to die. He's going to be buried. He's going to come back, but he's going on all these terrible things. He's going to be, blasphemed, et cetera, et cetera. And Peter's like, whoa. My paraphrase, this is my translation from the original Greek. And Peter said, whoa. That's not what I signed up for. And Jesus, in that moment, as a lot of the stories of the four Gospels relay, Jesus is constantly fighting this uphill battle with his followers, and we are those followers if we identify as Christian, FYI. That what we expect is maybe sometimes easier or more comfortable than what actually is we're being invited to. I bring that up because I feel I resonate with Peter sometimes. I want the easy, yeah, I'm a Christian, I go to church on Sunday, I do this, that, and the other, I'm a well-meaning, I'm a good white person, quote unquote, I'm not part of the KKK. I don't use racial slurs. I don't discriminate overtly against people. I'm good. I want it to be that easy. But that's not what it's all. There's more to the story. And I think from the Christian perspective, what we sign up for is actually deeply challenging and hard. And there is at times that struggle. And can we overcome the fear? One last plug about the Gospel of Mark. It doesn't end well. Jesus is right, by the way. But the Gospel of Mark, unlike the other three Gospels, really ends very badly. It ends on this note of fear, where the disciples, the women, go to the tomb, they see that it's empty, and they run away. The last words in Mark's Gospel are, they run away and tell nobody because they were afraid, period. It's a powerful story only because the readers know, the author of Mark knows, we know how it ends. But I always rest with that because do we say nothing? Do we run away from it because we are afraid? Or do we have trust in what follows as people of faith, right? So that's the faith element of this. And I'm sorry. Thank you, Dr. Hill, for letting me preach a little bit here. Give a little homilette.
You need an offering now.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. We'll pass the plate.
You got to catch that.
Exactly. You can leave your checks out to Redgina Hill.
or Navian or Sally Mae.
Exactly.
You wanted another question, so one more question. The hour's drawing near.
If anyone has a...
We sound so churchy, the hour's drawing near.
Can I say something as people are finding the courage to say their comment or question?
Yeah.
Or to scurry out because they were afraid, like the early disciples? I want to thank you, Dr. Hill, for your questions, for this conversation, for your leadership on this campus and in the broader community. I didn't have an opportunity because she's running the show for me to say that, but everything you said about our conversations is reciprocal, and I'm so grateful to be at St. Mary's that we can have conversations like this. As Dr. Hill mentioned, this is just the first of a lot of things that we're scheming up for the year. So stay tuned. Don't just spam your all SMC emails in your inbox. Good stuff are to come, and so I'm deeply honored and grateful for not only to you and to the Division for Inclusion and Equity, but to all of you on a Monday afternoon to trudge out here on a super humid day, right? Did anyone else like nearly pass out on the way to Natalie? But thank you. And I will be around to talk, and I'm always around now too, by the way, Center for Spirituality, come see me in Spaz. To talk. So I'm stalling for you who have a question or a comment, if anyone does.
Thank you. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, thank you all for coming. Good job. Yes, be on the lookout for more emails, all SMC, with more events. Have a good evening.
Take care.